Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Barry and Kate, for inviting me to talk to you today about a topic close to my heart, about governance during times of disruption, which, if anyone has not been under a rock for the last 18, 24 months, would be very, very aware that we've been going through a very unusual, turbulent time. And as individuals and organizations, we had to navigate our way through that time as successfully or with as minimum damage as possible. What I'll try to do is to give a bit of a framework, and I'll try to steer away from being too theoretical, but setting the foundation is probably a good thing for those of you who are not used to dealing with the formal side of setting up a governance, other than navigating sign-off. I promise you, it's not just that. I'll give a little bit more around expectations, and finally, I'll cover on what actually happens in reality. Towards the end, I'll touch a little bit about what actually happens within a crisis, what is the psychology of the crisis, and then how we can build something that will give us the governance, the structure, the framework that we need to operate during times of disruptions and crisis. But at the same time, and being true to this month's theme and this group theme, is agile enough so that we are able to be adaptable and use it moving forward. So with that, a very quick disclaimer. This is personal context, personal opinion, does not reflect current or past employees. And any examples I might share are highly anonymized, so please don't try to read into who have had this done. And before I move on, I think I'll just start with a bit of a scenario or a bit of a story, which we tend, anyone who's done a postgraduate degree or a diploma or qualification, these tend to be a very beloved essay-style questions. And the scenario goes as this. You're the new head of financial crime for a multinational organization. You've just got your approval from your regulator. You've just signed off on the dotted lines with your statements of responsibility, which those of you who are not in financial services may not be aware of. It's effectively you're committing in a personal capacity to delivering to the organization and to the regulator based on certain standards and minimum requirements and a level of due care and diligence. And if you don't, then you personally can be liable for any failures. You wake up in the morning, there's about 30 plus emails in your inbox. Basically, you've had a failure in one of your core systems, in one of the subsidiaries under your jurisdictions. You still don't know the scope of it, how long it's been going on, what is the impact, what's the regulatory side of things. You just have a bit of a blind panic circulating across the whole organizations. Now, anyone who's done a thesis or a essay types question, as I mentioned, we usually have about a leisurely 3 to 4 weeks to come up with an answer to present. In real life, you don't have that. In real life, you have that response that every second you're delaying that response, the 30 emails become 40 emails, the 5 managing directors on the email train turn into 10, turns into 20. Next thing you know, the whole situation is out of chaos. And in an essence, that is a scenario that one tries to avoid. And however, that's the scenario that in reality would materialize more than we would like to. We'll come back to our head of financial crime towards the end and see how they navigated this. So, bit of a brief introduction about the framework. If you look at what governance means, and here I'm just taking from the ICA's postgraduate diploma in governance, risk and compliance, it's a very straightforward. It's involved having necessary mechanism to identify risk, having the ability to respond to them, and devise a compliance solution. And again, this may sound very focused on financial services, but if you take a step back, it's the ability to navigate an organization to minimize the risk and maximize the reward for stakeholders. crisis bit of it and the risk extent of it is very much depending on circumstances. And it applies to all organizations, not just financial services. Breaking down that, there's an element of anticipations. So what predictive measures that we have that allows us to identify or foresee risk or foresee changes in business and business operations. How we can manage those or maximize those if we're looking at opportunities, not just risk management. And then how can we respond to them? And again, the focus on responding to the risk event, it tends to be the assumption that proactive engagement into positive business expansion is part of the DNA of business, and you don't need to necessarily be defining that you will go after a profitable opportunity. However, how you would manage a risk that materialized is something that there's an expectation that you will have in place and a need to ensure that it's always captured properly. In addition to that, I will add 3 key points, and those are points that I've identified, again, through real-life examples, through conversation with senior leaderships, as absolutely necessary to have in place for any successful organization to be able to navigate normal business activity, and they become even increasingly critical during time of distress. Communication and messaging. The flow of information is critical, is central, and should not be an afterthought in normal business, more so during crisis. Responsibility assignment matrix, again, one of the favorite acronym, RACI matrix, is by no means racy, is actually critical, is who's responsible, who's accountable, who should be consulted, and who should be informed. And one would think that is a very self-informed and evidencing piece of corporate artifact that is established and is put in place and followed. We will soon find out shortly after, later in this presentation, that this is something that will be challenged, probably the first thing that gets challenged. Last, but by no means, learning from experience. Any opportunity to learn from past events is critical. Crisis presents more of an opportunity for learning for an organization compared to other events. And from a governance point of view, maturing and developing that governance absolutely relies on learning from past mistakes, even more than past failures. So that's the theory. The one I wanted to talk about with expectation is because, unfortunately, it's usually that's where that's the bar that an organization gets judged against, whether by its shareholders, by the board, by your employees, they're part of your stakeholders, regulators, the local community, and as such, tends to be very, very visible, very, very critical, and very relevant for organization, because that's what they're being measured against. It's not what they've done. It doesn't matter how they've set up things internally. It's the expectation that are out there against how that organization that they will be assessed against. And again, it very much varies depending on the sector you're in, where you have certain requirements that tend to be written into the regulations, if not just broadly into, say, something like the Company Act, but you have specific requirements or your business, as well as the maturity of the organization and the sector. But the expectation is that as an organization, and I'm now talking about a large, multinational, mature, well-established firm, that they will have an established framework, that is single, all-encompassing, reflecting all the points that we've touched earlier. That's a mature, reflects the complexity of the firm. Our RACI matrix is reflected through very clearly defined roles and responsibilities for named individuals across the firm. Again, whether that's a regulatory requirement or just good business practice, is subject to continuous enhancement, not just written and put to one side, and is tested periodically. And when you say it's tested, it is tested to an extent that allows identification of any weaknesses, rather than just a passing comment or a passing look. every 1 year or so to make sure, yeah, that still looks okay. What happens in reality, and how does these things are executed? In reality, the bigger the organization, usually, you'll find this even more complex setup, even more pronounced. You'll have multiple arrangements simply because the business has grown, usually through merger and acquisitions and buybacks and restructuring. And you end up inheriting legacy structures from other businesses, including governance structures, different business lines, products, set up teams, roles and responsibilities, and consolidating those all into a single governance arrangement doesn't always tend to be at the top of the priority list. It gets there and usually is done at the top level, at the leadership level within the firm, but it takes a significantly long period of time for it to cascade downwards, especially into your core layer, which is your middle management, where a surprising amount of information and decisions and roles and responsibility linger, which may not necessarily be challenged and consolidated in normal circumstances. However, at time of distress, these are tested, and that's where you see the first cracks. It is subject to review. That tends to be almost an expectation that all your core governance and framework documentation are reviewed periodically, usually annually. But there's a difference between a proper deep review that is reflecting, looking at the business and seeing what things needs to be changed, versus a desktop review of a document. Yes, I need to change the date from June 2020 to June 2021. Yes, this is now the head of so-and-so rather than head of so-and-so. And basically, let's park it for another 12 months. Limited or no stress testing. And people might be slightly surprised with that. It's simply because we know how to stress test operational resilience. We know how to stress test financial stability. Depending on your sector, it's physical security, is employees, is people. However, how do you stress test a governance structure? You have to have very specific and very focused testing scenarios that allow you to test, will my command flow, will my corporate setup withstand pressure in any given scenario? And that is not something that you can measure by numbers. That is something that you can assess by people's reactions and corporate response to events. So usually we're talking about wargaming and scenario type testing, which again is not something that is commonly carried out. I mentioned RACI matrix gets challenged. Absolutely. If we go back to our newly appointed head of financial crime, the fact that they're new appointment would probably mean that they will have their role and responsibility and accountability questions immediately. They don't have the inherent background that, or potentially they haven't yet mapped out all their stakeholders if they're new to the firm. And then the bigger the disturbances, the bigger the challenges, especially if it goes across multiple parts of the business, you'll have senior leadership wanting to be involved, away from whether they are responsible, accountable, or should be consulted or informed. They will feel personally passionate about what's going on and want to have their say. I was listening recently to a very informative podcast called Crisis What Crisis, highly advisable. And they were talking about to one of the senior civil servants in the UK, Lord Stockwell, about how he was navigating or helping the government navigate through the COVID crisis. One of the things he said is that there's a personal element to crisis and high distress situation, which basically brings a lot of egos into the room. And that's something that needs to be managed because those egos would not necessarily result in the best outcome necessary. That challenge to the RACI matrix is an absolute reflection of that potential ego, or in a more relevant point or a more caring point is that people are passionate about their businesses and they will want to get the best out of it, and they feel that they probably will be able to contribute more. That is something that sometimes derail our response setup because they are not captured in that RACI matrix, and it's not their responsibility to do so. Last, again, but by no means not least, breakdown in communications. They will be strained. They're always an afterthought. In a lot of cases, communications are seen as something that needs to be controlled, and that control usually means needs to be limited with a view of not causing too much panic or managing expectations. The problem is that results in completely the opposite. What will happen is that the communications will become strained, not relevant, outdated fairly quickly, could worse, they'll result in bad or wrong decision being made because the right information are not cascading to the people that need to know about them. And then people will go back to their most favorite source, unofficial grapevine channels, to get updates. And then you have lost control of the narrative. Losing control of the narrative in an organization during crisis could consume a good 30 to 40% of your bandwidth, just managing that narrative, trying to bring it back to what it should be, managing the expectation of those stakeholders we mentioned earlier, which is 30% of your effort, which you can't afford to lose. Why does that happen? And that's where I wanted to pause a bit. The reason is, and we tend to forget that, distress or crisis or disruption, there's a psychology to that. In the end, no matter what business you are in, we haven't yet all been replaced by machine, and machine do learn their responses from people. People are at the heart of organization, and where time of crisis, there's a personal, there's a very internal, visceral response that gets triggered by the employees and by the people within that organization. And that's not something that can be controlled, and not always is taken into consideration. So to assume that everybody will see an update or respond to a situation in exactly the same way is very short-sighted, because people respond based on their personal background, their experiences, where they are. And again, it's another thing that we have seen through the COVID challenge over the last year, is that people have responded in a very vastly different way from what their organization expected them to behave. And in a way, if your governance structure is based on certain setup and certain assumption about human behavior, that take into consideration needing to be flexible enough to reflect individuals who will be actually executing on those setup, then you're already out of balance just purely from that point. It's unscripted. And yes, I was just talking about wargaming and scenario testing and all of that. But in reality, a crisis will unfold, a crisis unfolds. And you have to, an extent, have a setup that allows you to be comfortable knowing that you have incomplete information and you have limited control of how events will unfold, but still be able to group people around the central problem and try to navigate an organization through that. It's unscripted, but that doesn't mean that you can throw your governance framework out of baby with the bathwater, as they say. But the idea is to have something which is flexible enough to allow you to manage that unscripted aspect of it. Uncontained spillovers are awfully common. And when I say spillover, it's usually across teams, across sectors. Again, major events will have impact on whole economies and whole countries. And as such, your planning and your setup may have taken into effect events of certain magnitude, but would not necessarily have reflected on that broader set of event. And again, how to respond to that, how to manage that. Last point is, again, something that, and this is more closer for those of you who come from a risk background, we tend to think of risk and record risk in organization and in business setup in a very linear way, as in X happens, Y is the result. In reality, in business and in life, you have something which is called a risk network rather than a response, rather than a linear response, i.e., that one factor will be interconnected with other factors, will have a result of a multitude of consequences which themselves will correlate and cause that a wider set of disruption that you have thought in the past. If you're measuring your resilience and responsiveness in a linear fashion rather than a scenario-based testing, you'll completely miss that. And during time of disruption and your time of stress, you'll basically find that there are whole segments of your business which you haven't thought will be impacted by the event, but they are, because of that interconnectivity that you may not have thought of. So what do happen? What does our newly appointed head of financial crime does when he gets that email, or 30 or 40 emails waking up in the morning? How do you manage best practice? I think the thing is that there's very core element to this. There's an element of withstanding crisis, withstanding, not necessarily surviving unscathed, but being able to navigate it in a way that will allow an organization to continue to exist post that event. And now I'm talking about existential type of level of disruptions, basically. And to do that, absolutely and fundamentally, you have to have a robust governance structure that will withstand that crisis, that is yet agile enough and dynamic enough that allows you to respond to a multitude of crises. Because in a way, having something which is robust and rigid could itself become the downfall of an organization if it's not adaptive enough to a crisis that, as we mentioned before, is unscripted, is not following what we expected events to unfold. And what would that governance structure, how would that governance structure unfold? The best examples I've seen throughout my career, and with clients and companies and I worked with or I came in touch with, governance structures and setups that are involved across the horizontal and verticals across the organizations. It's involved in organization, individuals across all levels, not seen as something which sits at a senior level only, or something that sits with a bespoke function within the firm. It needs to capture everyone from front to back office. It's built across multiple teams, areas, and silos, as I said, whether seniorities or divisions, to try to capture, as we mentioned before, that event of interconnected risk networks, so that you're sure that when you're building that structure, when you agreed that setup for a robust governance setup for your organization, you have spoken to everyone and you have listened to everyone, you have that unique perspective, and everybody, more critically, has contributed into building that governance, so they will be less willing to challenge it if it comes to play. Your RACI matrix needs to be agreed at the higher level across all the parts of the organization and needs to be very transparent. That is key in order to make sure that second point, that defined roles and responsibilities that mirror that RACI matrix, are very well known, are very well understood, and where possible, unless in extreme circumstances, are not challenged. That challenge, again, consumes a significant amount of resource when suddenly people don't know who's now responsible for approving certain communications. If your RACI matrix says XYZ, somebody has a clear role or responsibility as head of communication, but then you have another senior manager that says, no, I want XYZ. Delays, wasted effort, challenge, breakdown in communications, breakdown in response. And all of that is something that you have to invest in. This is not, again, a governance structure that is set up as a paper exercise will not be able to give you the coverage and the support and the protection that as an organization you would need. And to have something that is robust enough to be able to withstand that crisis, that does require an investment. Governance is seen sometimes as a bit of a it's a corporate secretariat, it's an administrative side of the business. It's a cost. And as such, as long as we satisfy the minimum requirement, we don't need to put too much effort into it. Actually, you do, because at time of disruption, at time of crisis, that's the first thing that will come into light. Why did we do? How did we do it? Who agreed that we will do it that way? So think of it from that lines. And if you haven't invested in that testing, in building that rigorous structure that is periodically tested, then you won't be able to answer those questions. And I think that's where sometimes you fall within organization, and that tends to be a challenge. The last, and again, not least, for larger organizations, we tend to build things for head office, for the core of the business, and we tend to forget that there are new parts of the business that are coming online. There are new products, new businesses, new team, subsidiaries and branches, who they will have their own say. And the governance structure needs not to change for any minor change in a subsidiary or a branch per se. There's an element of proportionality that needs to be taken into consideration here, but at least an acknowledgement and an understanding of how executing through that governance structure, setting that up, and then responding due time of crisis, how will that impact on those subsidiaries, on those peripheries, which might, in certain circumstances, be actually the saving grace of their head office. If you think, for example, with a geographical location-based disturbance, where something happens to head office, and actually it's the peripheries, it's the branch subsidiaries that are holding head office or the core of the organization up. And how do you capture all of that? It's simple. It's a crisis playbook. Every organization should have one, and every organization should have a single framework document. I'm glad to say that more and more I actually now see this kind of a crisis book. It's sometimes called event response framework or policy, sitting at the top policy documentation level at an organization. So similar to your global whistleblowing policy and your global HR policy, you will have a framework document that is basically your response document. And that is visible for everyone. It's refreshed, it's tested. More importantly, it's actually very clear in setting those expectations we talked about. Some of the really good examples I've seen actually goes down into, this is the kind of communication that you should be thinking about. This is the kind of timeline, depending on criticality or materiality of when do you communicate, how you communicate, who's responsible for engaging with regulators. You would think that sounds very cumbersome and the opposite of being agile. In reality, it's not. There are a plethora of tools out there that allows you to write these kind of frameworks in a dynamic way, so that it's constantly being changed, it's constantly being looked at, but more importantly, it's always reflective of what you need to do, and everybody knows where to go when something happens. It's true to at the point of triggering, and I think that is absolutely critical during a crisis event. I wanted to close on a more of a positive, or to try to come up with a positive note. If you see how some of the organizations and some of the businesses navigated the last 18 months, you would see that while some have strained massively, continue to be strained, and again, that's sometimes driven by factors like sector and how exposed or not they were to the lockdown or the COVID, the health crisis itself. But others have actually thrived, not because they are in the right place, not because they're in the right sector. I'm not talking about your PPE providers and distributors. They thrive because they looked at disruption as an opportunity. They had enough robustness, they have invested enough initially to be able to mobilize a response when events started unfolding early last year, which meant that they didn't have to waste a lot of time and effort and resources at the onset to try to navigate what are we going to do. They hit the ground running. They recognize this is what we need to do with our outsourcing centers. This is what needs to happen. This is how we can mobilize people from offices to virtual desk. This is how we can ensure our entire phone operating call centers are able to connect and support our clients. They've had that already in place. They were able to mobilize that. And then while everybody else was trying to catch up and try to answer those big, huge questions that was hitting business in the first few weeks, they were very much able to then focus, okay, this is not going away anytime soon. What can we do? And those organizations, and again, I will avoid naming names, have been able to position themselves in a way that sets them as market leaders in whichever sectors they were sitting. They were able to not just withstand the disruption, they were able to come to market with innovative solutions, with human-centric solutions that answered some of the core questions that those market and their clients' needs. In that sense, they used the crisis as a way to test their structure, to test their strategy. They then took that as an opportunity to potentially even look at things that they haven't never thought of challenging before and see what can we do out of that. To that effect, although we're still not yet over this crisis, looking at past performance and looking at how have we responded, could we have done it better, has been of equal importance because that will allow the organization, as I mentioned, to learn and evolve from those extreme events that you wish will never happen again. But if you don't learn of how you navigated that event, then it's a missed opportunity. And with that in mind, investment that I mentioned in an earlier slide in a governance structures that allow you to do all of that is actually an investment in the future of the organization, not just simply a safeguarding measure. It's something that will feed into an organization growth, will reflect on the dynamism that an organization can reflect, and will actually help drive the future of that organization and sector if executed well. And that's definitely always an investment worth putting. With that, I just wanted to close on a comment, or actually a quote from a movie. I know people have different views on Keanu Reeves, but the day after the day the Earth stood still, there's a comment that always comes to me. It's only at the brink that people find the will to change. It's only as the precipice do we evolve. And in essence, severe disruption and crises are the epicenter of how we change as organizations and individuals. And it's at that point where you will be able to succeed and do the right choice or fail as an organization or an individual. I think in a way, if we look at disruption with that lens and ensure that we have the governance structure that we have thought in place that will reflect the organization behavior during those disruptions, then making the right choice is always there for that organization as much as possible, or the survival of the organization is much more. No one is guaranteed a survival, but a best fighting chance is sometimes the best thing that we can hope for. And with that, I will thank you for your time and your patience, and happy to welcome any questions. Thank you very much.